Okay, let's unpack this. There's been quite a lot of talk recently, hasn't there, about this new ultimatum. The U.S. to Russia regarding Ukraine. You've seen the headlines, heard the chatter, I'm sure. But what's really going on behind those bold statements? Is it, a decisive new strategy, or is something else entirely at play here? Today, we're doing a deep dive into an analysis, a really insightful one, that suggests this latest move by the US president back in July 2025 is maybe less about a concrete plan, to end the war, and perhaps more about a strategic, well, the analysis calls it a bluff, rooted in some pretty deep frustration. So, our mission today is to peel back those layers, understand why this perspective is gaining traction, what might really be driving the U.S. leaders' actions, and critically, what the implications could be for everyone involved. It's complex.
Indeed, and our goal really is to dissect this major geopolitical maneuver. We want to help you understand not just what happened, but why it matters. And what's fascinating here, I think, are the nuances it reveals about international relations and just the sheer complexity of this ongoing conflict.
Okay, so let's start with the ultimatum itself. What exactly did the U.S. president put on the table in July 2025? What were the specifics?
Right. Well, what's really crucial to understand here is the stark shift in approach. The president issued this revised demand to Russia and drastically shortened the deadline for a ceasefire in Ukraine. We're talking 10 to 12 days, which is way down from an earlier, much more generous 50-day deadline that had been floated. And this demand, it came with a very specific promise to supply Ukraine with advanced weaponry, specifically long-range missiles,
Right.
with the funding for these weapons supposedly coming from NATO allies. Now, our source frames this whole package through the lens of a bluff.
The bluff. That's quite a strong word in international diplomacy, isn't it? How does the analysis define that, and why does it seem to apply here?
Absolutely, it is a strong word. So, in international relations, a bluff, as defined here, is basically a strategic move where a leader makes a bold threat or maybe a promise, but without the full intention, or perhaps more importantly, the full capability to actually follow through. The aim isn't necessarily to execute the threat itself. It's more about influencing the opponent's behavior, purely through psychological pressure.
Yeah.
And from the analysis we're looking at, this ultimatum fits that pattern because it seems to be signaling resolve, signaling an endgame, maybe more than setting an immediate achievable goal. It's really about perception management.
So if this is a bluff, it's not just about this specific instance, is it? What does this kind of strategy tell us about the bigger picture, the challenges leaders face today in just projecting power?
Exactly. I think that's a key takeaway. It's a stark reminder that even a superpower, operates with significant constraints. This move, maybe more than anything, highlights the diminishing returns of traditional coercive diplomacy when domestic consensus is fractured, allies are stretched thin, and your adversaries have diversified their support systems. That's the real kind of profound insight here, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so this analysis points to several pretty compelling reasons why this latest move is seen as more rhetorical than substantive. What's the first clue this source identifies?
Well, the very first thing that just jumps out is the time frame, the sheer impracticality of it. A 10 to 12-day deadline to get a ceasefire in a conflict that's been grinding on for over 3 years. It's, let's be frank, pretty unrealistic. Ceasefire negotiations are incredibly complex. They need extensive diplomatic groundwork, right?
Not sure.
Agreements on terms, verification mechanisms, mutual concessions. And Russia, for instance, has its own preconditions. Things like Ukraine's neutrality, demilitarization, dropping NATO aspirations. These are just complete non-starters for Kiev and its Western allies. So that compressed timeline, it really suggests a lack of serious expectation that Moscow will actually comply. Makes it feel more like a public statement than a genuine workable deadline.
Yeah, that 10 to 12-day deadline definitely raises eyebrows, but that's just one piece, isn't it? What other factors make this ultimatum seem less like a concrete plan?
Right. Another significant indicator, according to the analysis, is the vagueness of the consequences threatened. The U.S. leader mentioned things like 100% tariffs and these secondary sanctions on countries still trading with Russia, specifically called out China and India.
And when you say secondary sanctions, just for our listeners, what exactly does that mean? What does that involve?
Good question. It essentially means targeting third-party countries, those still doing business with Russia,
Yeah.
basically forcing them to choose sides in a way that directly hits their own economies. But, the U.S. actually has very limited direct trade with Russia itself. Russian imports, for example, are tiny, like 0.2% of total U.S. imports. So imposing such broad secondary sanctions on major economies like China or India, that could provoke pretty significant retaliation, disrupt global trade massively. It's a huge risk, one that you'd likely hesitate on without much broader, stronger international backing. And the lack of clarity on exactly how these sanctions would be enforced also suggests the threat is more rhetorical than a policy ready to go.
Okay, so the time frame's impractical, the threats are kind of vague. It almost sounds like, yeah, a high-stakes performance. But then you mentioned Russia's reaction. Do they just sort of shrug it off?
That's pretty much exactly what happened, and that reaction further weakens the ultimatum's effectiveness, right? Russian officials have consistently downplayed these demands. You had Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rabkov calling them unacceptable, and former President Dmitry Medvedev. He labeled the initial 50-day ultimatum theatrical and explicitly said Russia didn't care.
Oh.
So Moscow's sort of nonchalant public response, combined with its ongoing military operations, it really indicates the Kremlin just doesn't see these threats as credible. And a credible threat, by definition, needs the target to actually believe the issuer is willing and able to act. If that belief isn't there,
Then the threat loses its power. Yeah, Moscow's reaction certainly chips away at it. But we also have to look at the U.S. leader's own position, don't we? What about the constraints? Domestic international pressures?
that's a really crucial aspect, yes. The leader's ability to actually escalate economic or military pressure is significantly constrained, both at home and abroad. Domestically, think about implementing sweeping tariffs or sanctions. That would need substantial congressional support, which, given the current partisan divisions, is far from guaranteed. And internationally, well, NATO allies generally support arming Ukraine, sure, but they might very well resist footing the bill for U.S.-made weapons or endorsing aggressive sanctions that could seriously harm their own economies, especially in Europe. The analysis points out that this reliance on European funding for the weapons shipments, it actually kind of dilutes the ultimatum's punch because it shifts the burden away from direct, unilateral U.S. action.
Right, and then there's that apparent contradiction, isn't there? Demanding a ceasefire while also pushing for more advanced weapons. What does the analysis make of that mixed message?
That's a key observation in the analysis, yeah. It highlights this as a significant contradiction. Pushing simultaneously for advanced weapons, weapons capable of striking deep into Russia, while also demanding an immediate ceasefire. It creates a fundamentally contradictory narrative. Supplying long-range missiles inherently escalates things, doesn't it? It could potentially undermine the very prospects for immediate peace talks. So this duality, it suggests the ultimatum is maybe less about actually securing a ceasefire and more about projecting strength to lots of different audiences: Russia, Ukraine, NATO, the U.S. domestic base, while potentially masking the lack of a fully coherent or maybe even actionable long-term strategy.
Okay, so we've dug into why this ultimatum might be seen as a bluff, but that raises an even deeper question, doesn't it? What's fueling this kind of strategy? Our analysis peels back another layer here, suggesting a core driver: profound frustration.
Yes, absolutely. This ultimatum seems very much a reflection of deep and escalating frustration. The U.S. leader has openly expressed exasperation with Putin after, well, a series of unproductive phone calls. The pattern, apparently, was incredibly frustrating. Seemingly positive conversations would happen, and then almost immediately, Russia would launch massive missile strikes on Ukrainian cities. This led to the blunt conclusion, and this is a quote from the source, that talk doesn't mean anything. So this erosion of confidence in diplomatic channels has clearly pushed things towards this kind of high-stakes public rhetoric, trying to regain some leverage.
And I imagine the relentless, ongoing escalation of attacks by Russia wouldn't exactly help ease that frustration either.
No, absolutely not. Russia's intensified aggression, we're talking nightly barrages, sometimes over 400 missiles and drones, that significantly increases the pressure to respond decisively.
Right.
And beyond that, you had the failure of, 3 separate rounds of ceasefire talks hosted by Turkey. None yielded any meaningful progress. That just further highlights how intractable the conflict itself is. And that kind of sustained, brutal reality, it directly frustrates any goal of a quicker, decisive resolution. It grinds you down.
What's been Ukraine's reaction to all this? Have they been fully on board with the U.S. leader's approach? Or is it more complicated?
It's definitely been more complicated. Ukraine's perspective has been notably mixed, which certainly adds another layer to the frustration for the U.S. side. Kiev Mayor Vitaly Klitschko, for example, he criticized the initial 50-day deadline, remember? Said it was far too long, just allowed Russia to keep bombarding them. And then you had Ukrainian MP Kira Rudik calling the announcement bittersweet. That reflects a clear distrust in the U.S. leader's motives, maybe, and a genuine skepticism about their ability to actually pressure Russia effectively. This lack of full confidence from a key ally, it definitely undermines that narrative of being a decisive deal-maker. Complicate things. Then, of course, you can't ignore the domestic political pressure back in the U.S. The U.S. leader made a very prominent promise during the 2024 campaign, didn't they? To end the war quickly. The continued lack of progress risks alienating parts of their base, many of whom view prolonged U.S. involvement as costly, maybe unnecessary. So issuing a bold ultimatum, even if it is largely a bluff, it serves a domestic purpose too. Helps maintain that image of being a strong, decisive leader who's tackled these concerns head on.
And broadening our scope a bit, how do Russia's allies fit into this increasingly complex geopolitical picture? What role do they play in adding to this sense of frustration?
Oh, that's a huge complicating factor. Absolutely. The involvement of Russia's allies, specifically thinking about China, North Korea, it significantly complicates any Western strategy. You even have Ukrainian residents themselves pointing out that Russia's aggression is consistently sustained by external support, weapons, economic lifelines. That makes achieving a ceasefire much, much harder. And the U.S. leader's frustration is surely compounded by this very real realization that truly isolating Russia economically or militarily is an incredibly daunting task in today's world, this complex multipolar world.
And just briefly for our listener, when we talk about a multipolar world, what exactly are we referring to there?
Right. Good point. It basically means a world where power isn't just concentrated in one or maybe two major nations like during the Cold War. Instead, power, influence, it's increasingly distributed among many different centers, making global consensus, making unilateral action much harder to achieve. And yeah, that definitely compounds frustrations when your traditional levers of power aren't working quite like they used to.
Okay, so if this is indeed a bluff, as the analysis suggests, what does this all mean for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, for U.S. foreign policy going forward? What are the practical implications, the so what, for you, the listener?
Well, there are several pretty crucial implications, I think. First, there's a definite risk of escalation, paradoxically perhaps. By publicly promising advanced weapons while issuing these ultimatums, there's a very real chance of actually escalating the conflict, not resolving it. Russia's rejection, their intensified attacks, it suggests Moscow might just double down, try to maximize gains before any theoretical deadline hits, making a diplomatic solution even more distant. Second, and this is critical, it risks an erosion of credibility long term. If the U.S. leader consistently fails to follow through on these really bold threats, their credibility as a global leader could be significantly undermined. Russia's dismissal, calling it theatrical, and Ukraine's own skepticism, they highlight this immense challenge of maintaining influence when your threats start to be perceived as hollow. That can have systemic impacts, Third, we could potentially see strained alliances. That reliance on NATO allies to fund weapons shipments, it might start to strain transatlantic relations, especially if European nations feel pressured into costly commitments without seeing clear strategic gains or a clear path to peace emerging from it. That could weaken Western unity, which is obviously critical. And finally, there's the potential for domestic political fallout back home. Sure, supporters might see the ultimatum as bold, decisive, but a failure to deliver tangible results on that big campaign promise, that could fuel sharp criticism from opponents arguing U.S. foreign policy lacks coherence. That mixed messaging we talked about, arming Ukraine while demanding a ceasefire, it might just confuse voters, ultimately weaken domestic standing. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really underscores this idea, I think, that a lasting resolution, it probably requires moving beyond bluffs towards a strategy that's genuinely grounded in, well, realistic diplomacy and properly coordinated international action, not just gestures.
Right. So what we've really unpacked today suggests that this recent ultimatum to Russia, while it looks bold on the surface, this analysis sees it more as a reflection of, well, deep frustration, rather than a clear path to peace. It's a really fascinating look at the psychological chess match of international relations, isn't it?
Exactly. It's about perception as much as it is about reality. Leaders making moves not just on a battlefield, but in the minds of their opponents, their allies, trying to predict and influence reactions.
Yeah, and the challenges of just projecting power effectively in this, as you said, increasingly complex world. So the analysis ends by suggesting that for a lasting resolution, the U.S. would need a strategy grounded in realistic diplomacy and coordinated international action.
Right.
So as you reflect on this, maybe consider what that truly means in this complex, multipolar world we've been talking about. What might such a strategy actually look like, given all the frustrations and constraints we've discussed? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. We really hope this has given you a shortcut to being well-informed and maybe sparked some new insights for you to explore.